we actually printed a secret speech that was given in Cambodia by Pol Pot himself, basically admitting that this is exactly what they do. That they went in and they was like, well, yeah, we couldn't call it communism at first, but we infiltrated the academia, we infiltrated the schools, we infiltrated the media, we infiltrated politics. And then finally, once after we took over everything, then we could tell you, actually, we were the communists all along. So it's very clear. And in fact, it's in their own words. It's one of the first times you'll find in English this secret speech printed in a publication from Pol Pot to the people of the party, which was now known as the Khmer Rouge or the Communist Party of Cambodia. But Joshua, you were talking about the fandom of Luigi Maggioni, and these things arise when you come into a situation where, you know, you do have these massive dispersals of, and we're just going to call it, right? We point out many times in the book when people say, well, it's inequality, it's inequality, it's inequality. And there are inequalities, by the way. And this is true. And it's something that conservatives get wrong all the time. And they say, oh, well, there's inequality, so you should just not worry about it, or you should just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But what happens when those disparities become so huge, when people can't afford rent in New York City, and yet they see Jeff Bezos is able to rent out all of Venice for his massive star-studded wedding, and people start to get upset. And eventually, emotionally, along comes a Luigi Maggioni, or I don't know, say a enterprising young immigrant from Uganda, although of an Indian extraction, and says, perhaps we can just vote to take those people's stuff away and redistribute it to you yourselves. And that's Zoran Mamdani. And guess what? That's the exact same city that is now cheering, many people in that city cheering Luigi Maggioni, who was shot just a few miles away. Conducted his killing just a few miles away, where he killed his victim. So, you know, you see these same forces and same pressures brought to bear. And Steve Bannon, of course, famously said at one of the speeches he was giving, one of these talks to media, and he was explaining populism. And he said, look, and he was basically preaching the gospel of unhuman, saying, look, you either get us with MAGA or you get Luigi Maggioni. Pick your poison. And now you've got a guy who very well may be the next mayor of New York City, who's saying what? Redistribute the wealth, who's saying put higher taxes on white neighborhoods, who's saying that we need to seize the means of production, who wants government-run food centers. Oh, government control of the food. Where have I heard that before? You know, and people say, this is what they do. This is what they do. Control the land, control the food. This isn't even, it's definitely cultural Marxism, but a lot of classic Marxism also mixed in. Joshua, unpack all this for us.
Yes, a phrase that I'm liking to call him Kami Mamdani, that he has been using, is class consciousness, which of course is an expression that was popularized by Karl Marx in the very first communists. And if we're going to look at that phrase, well, what does it mean to be class conscious? It means that there is the rich and there is the poor, and there's not a whole lot of separation between them. During the Industrial Revolution, Europe and other Western countries saw this quite a bit, where there were those who owned the factories, who owned the manufacturing supply chains, who were sitting high and large as sort of a self-appointed aristocracy, and they had great power and privilege. And then there were the working poor, who couldn't afford good homes, who couldn't afford good education for their kids, who couldn't afford, frankly, nutrition. And they were working the modern equivalent of basically 2, 3 or more jobs. And you had this severe, true inequality during the Industrial Revolution. And class consciousness is this idea that that is the most important aspect of society, is that there are the haves and the have-nots. And the haves only have by exploiting perpetually the have-nots. And so because this is unfair, we need to make it equal. Now, what happens often in this equalizing situation is we need to get revenge. We need to make the powerful and the privileged feel what we have. We need to make them suffer, which is why those participants of the Haitian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, when they were later interviewed following the success of the revolution, they would say things like, in English, for example, I didn't just want to be free. I wanted to own white slaves, is what they said. And there's that deep resentment there from the time of the Haitian Revolution. And so what often happens is there are people who don't have a lot of access to opportunities, frankly. And I might start to sound like a populist, and that's okay. That's what MAGA is, and you either get MAGA or you get Mangione and Kami Mamdani. There's not really any dividing. There's not really a third option at this point. Now, we have Mangione being a Bolshevik, where it's violence to get that revenge. And then you have sort of the Menshevik, the democratic socialist of, well, let's set up the government distribution food centers. Let's tax the white neighborhoods more. Let's make sure that there's fewer and fewer white people. Let's do these sorts of things, and that the percentage of immigrants are in these neighborhoods is increasing. You see, it's Menshevism, you might say. That sort of, well, it's not communism if you vote for it, right? And of course, what happened during the Spanish Civil War? Well, immediately prior to the Spanish Civil War, the socialists won the election, and what did they do? They allowed their communist allies to run roughshod over the Christians of rural Spain and the small business owners. And that's generally what happens right there.
I've got to double down on that piece for everyone is people have to understand that, because when people bring up the Spanish Civil War, they say, wait a minute, there was an election. Yes. But then what they did was, exactly as you say, they allowed all of the communist groups, what we would call the Antifa of today, or the BLM groups of the area, to be essentially deputized as a form of law enforcement and a form of a people's court system, taken directly from the French Revolution, verbatim, by the way, where the people's court now got to decide who would live, who would die, who would be in charge of the parish, who would be in charge of society. And they started killing, the priests and the nuns, exactly as what happened in the French Revolution 200 years prior, because this is what they do. So Joshua, to your point, is exactly right. They use this thin veneer of moderation to take power, and then they empower the Magiones and the extremists and the worst elements of their side. This is also why in Russia, by the way, you have the two revolutions. You have the February Revolution followed by the October Revolution, where the February Revolution took out the Tsar, but then they had the Russian Republic for about 5 minutes. And the October Revolution was when the Bolsheviks came up and said, no, this isn't going fast enough. We're just going to kill all you guys.
And that is often how it goes. And sometimes it's a little more targeted and not obvious, so that there's not a military response, which is what we talk about in the book Unhumans, that the United States has gone through a low-intensity conflict of an irregular communist revolutionary war, meaning it's been below the point of military reaction or response being, or even, let's say, significant nationwide policing being necessary, with the infiltration of academia and entertainment and government, where it sort of slowly happens without people realizing it. And this is the same sort of warfare that belligerents against the United States have been using after the Cold War, because they do not want to draw the ire and fire of the United States military. It's the same concept here with an irregular revolution. If we can make it happen slow enough, the people won't notice what's happening. And then those of us who call out what's happening, they attack and say, no, that's not happening. And then when it does, they say, no, that's not happening, and it's good that it is.
Well, this is also why we see the same tactic of the softening up, what we call anarcho-tyranny, where one of these other tactics that they do is rather than have police for the violent element of society, they allow those violent elements of society to be released into the general populace so that they can terrorize essentially the middle class. I believe I saw a headline recently that there was, going back to New York again, And New York City is a perfect example of this because it is America's greatest city. And the health of America's greatest city absolutely portends the trajectory and direction of our country. And so why are we talking about this so much when we talk about unhumans? Because you can see all of these things playing out within within just a few, a couple mile radius of each other, these same forces on America's greatest city streets. And so when you look at the release of violent criminals, this again is a tactic to terrorize the middle class, to terrorize the populace, to terrorize you tourists and you regular folks who would be law abiding. You are the ones who are the targets because you always are.